Crowdsourced Tribune presents, in association with Crowdsourced Politics. This is Cypher State.
Welcome back to another exciting episode of Cypher State. Cypher State is a foreign affairs and foreign policy focused podcast where myself and our good friend Tyberius D tackle issues facing the geopolitical stage with the kind of analysis you can only get from people of different worldviews. Today, we are going to talk about the UK and sovereign debt crisis. We will also be joined later in the show by our good friend Touring News. Let's go ahead and start getting into it. Boris Johnson, who became UK Prime Minister in 2019, was generally popular, but by June of this year, several scandals caught up to him. The icing on the cake was Partygate, a report that showed government officials had attended multiple social gatherings in a breach of COVID-19 regulations. By June of this year, more than 50 of Johnson's ministers quit, and most of his conservative lawmakers said he must go. And so, in early July, he announced he would resign.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister.
During the leadership fight to replace him, Liz Truss promised to marry neoliberal economic policies, like tax cuts, with a smattering of populist policies such as energy price controls.
Well, what I want to do is make sure people are supported from day one. That's why I'd have a temporary moratorium on the green energy levy to save people money from their fuel bills. What I will also do is reverse the national insurance rise to make sure people are keeping more of their own money. What's vitally important at this moment is we get economic growth going. And at the moment, we've got the highest taxes for 70 years. That's why I believe in lower taxes to get growth going, to encourage businesses to invest. And that way, there'll be more money in people's pockets.
The formula worked, and on September 6th, she was elected Prime Minister by her party. Her tenure was scarred by turmoil as her economic policies threatened the country's financial stability, caused chaos on bond markets, and drove the pound to record lows. On September 23rd, she proposed removing the top tier of income, meaning a savings for people who earn more than $168,000 a year, as part of an unfunded economic reforms. She proposed spending increases of $116 billion without providing details on how she would pay for it. Unnerved investors warned of soaring public debt, and Truss faced a growing political rebellion. On September 26, the pound lost more than 5% of its value against the dollar, and the resulting chaos damaged Britain's economic standing globally. By October 3rd, Truss had reversed course, but the damage was done.
It was a mandate built on fantasy economics, and it ended in disaster.
She sold herself as a free market-loving heir to the divisive former leader Margaret Thatcher.
I am a fighter and not a quitter.
But Truss's division caused an abrupt end to her time in office. Her 44-day tenure marks her the shortest serving Prime Minister in UK history.
I recognise, though, given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party.
At the time of recording, a new Prime Minister had not yet been chosen, but as of October 25th, Rishi Sunak was elected as Prime Minister. He is the first British Indian to serve as the UK's leader. We will bring you updates on Mr. Sunak's tenure as they occur, but let's go ahead and get back to the show. What do you think, Tiberius?
So, yeah, my thoughts on this are a little bit narrow, and then, of course, I always do like the big picture. The narrow thoughts largely are just that British politics absolutely suck right now. But the problem is that rapidly goes into the greater scheme here. Everyone's politics kind of suck right now. French politics suck. American politics sucks. British politics suck. Everyone sucks. And it's just because we're all going through a transition phase. And we haven't really figured out where the end of that is. I'm currently getting ready to do a presentation on that, although that's probably going to be 2 or 3 weeks from now. But the long and the short here is that until people realize what the new political normal is and the parties politically realigned to represent that, we're going to see a lot of discomfort in a lot of ways. And to kind of put this all into perspective here, we're definitely seeing this in the States, and it's a little different depending on where you go. But overall is that it used to be a coalition of labor versus business. And business used to have a right-wing coalition, and labor had the left-wing coalition. Now we're seeing it to where it's a lot more about social values, and that people are openly just saying, look, right now it's about the culture, and the culture's gone too far in certain directions. And you are seeing the right wing in almost every Western country get incredibly reactionary. They're not saying, whoa, we got to slow down. We got to be the speed breaks, right? They're saying, no, we need to go backwards. And we haven't seen this strong of an anti-progressive movement within the West since literally like the 1840s. Literally since the monarchists were literally like, you all are trying to tear the system apart way too quickly. I think that's the norm. I don't think this is going to be a fluke. I don't think this is going to hang on for a couple years. I think that you're going to see a lot of social regressives come out, particularly in the States, particularly in Turkey, and particularly in Japan. But every Western country is dealing with this, such as Le Pen in France, which we talked about recently. And now in Britain, is that Britain's having a problem to where their conservatives are a little different than everybody else's, because there's a level where their old establishment conservatives, which are largely these, you'd call them neocons, but basically these are folks that are like, big market, free enterprise folks. Truss kind of falls in with these folks. She and them, we just want to be like, look, Britain has had a heavy-handed economic policy since World War II, and every time that we cut back, such as under Thatcher, Britain seems to do pretty damn well. Let's go back to that. Let's do more of this. And they're having a problem with the populist right, which is just like, look, all of this sucks. Being involved with Europe sucks. This is why we did Brexit. Being involved with the systems writ large and globalism is terrible. Let's not deal with that. The issue is that unlike most other countries in the West, Britain's the exception. Britain thrives because it has global interconnections. London is a major financial power. It's not because of the fact that it is just this little government of 60 million people that's the size of Idaho. It's because it used to have a world-spanning empire and still retained that prominence of having some of the best banking in the world. And it's only now that we're coming into that. And I definitely want to talk about that, but it's a whole other side. So just bring me back to that later.
Sure. No, I think it's important to understand that basically what's kind of happening is in the UK's in the United States to a lesser degree, but very much prominently in the UK, is that there is a fight for what makes a person a conservative in the UK, in a similar vein of what makes a conservative in the United States. As Tiberius said, there seems to be this more populist element within the UK government and the United States government, and this is kind of a realignment of what these things mean. But at the same time, as one of the commenters said, the UK's got problems, even though it's kind of still an economic powerhouse, so to speak, with global interconnectedness, that it has high unemployment. It has an issue with youth unemployment, especially in some areas, feeling as though it's being controlled by the rest of the world rather than controlling the rest of the world. So there's some of that going in there as well, especially along the lines of the fishing industry, especially simply because you have to maintain stocks, right? You can't overfish, and they just like, well, we've been fishing this forever. Like, why can't we just go back to it? I'm like, it doesn't work that way. There's more people now. Like, your tiny town that was, supporting, 20 people fishing now is trying to support 400 or 500 people doing it. And so is everybody else. So you can't go back to that necessarily. And I don't know if people really grasp the complicatedness of that and why, international relations and international treaties on these things matter. But that's partly why Brexit happened, and it's partly why Johnson got elected. It's partly why he might be coming back, even despite all this stuff, right? He violated COVID restrictions, and I bet everybody was wishing they could too, and that's the only reason they were pissed off. Not so much that he did it, but because they weren't being allowed to when him and his team did. I don't know.
I can't speak if Johnson's coming back. Like, every time I turn around, the Brits just make me like weird out a little bit. I'm like, what are y'all doing? And why are you doing it? I don't understand. Please stop. What I can say is that the Conservative Party in Britain has kind of got the same issue that the Democratic Party has in the United States. It's not that they don't have people who are known, and it's not that they don't have people who can kind of take the mantle in. There's nobody within the party that remotely agrees on who should be in charge. And that's kind of the issue that I keep getting out of the Conservatives over in Britain, is just no one agrees within the Tories on what to do. And I'm going to be honest, I think that's part of the fact that the British political system hasn't really collapsed yet. The American system's already halfway through its transition. And granted, we're not remotely done yet. But the fact that the Republican Party has highly transitioned to what it was just 10 years ago, and the Democrats are kind of now having to follow suit just because they have, swing voters out and about. I expect that the Americans are going to be done probably around 2032, whenever this comes full circle. The Brits haven't really even started, and theirs usually takes even longer, or they have a national catastrophe, and whoever's just in charge is able to form a coalition government under the catastrophe, and then everybody sorts themselves out afterward. We might be at that catastrophe because of the banking sector, which I will talk about if you want to do that now or if you want to do that later.
No, we can go about it just a little bit later, because I think there's other stuff that we can hit on before the banking catastrophe, because we haven't talked about the tax issue yet. And I think that's parlays into the banking thing, because that's really what triggered it, right? So with the kind of things that are happening within the conservative parties globally, United States, UK, France specifically, there seems to be this growing sentiment that maybe business isn't necessarily on our side. The culture isn't there. We are really caring about cultural values. Personally speaking, I believe it's always been about the culture and less about economics. I don't think Carville was correct when he said it's the economy stupid. I think it's the culture stupid, unless the economy is in a situation that's pretty bad, if not, outright kind of like where the world is right now. So economy is on the forefront of most people's minds, but they're still being influenced by how they have their worldviews and where their culturally are in there. And with that, you have Truss, who is a Thatcherite, to be a neoliberal, release the beast that is business onto the world and let it do what it does, and we'll all benefit because it's kind of on our side, right? And at the other end, though, there are people that are like, wait, my energy bill's going up through the roof. Food is getting more expensive. Rents, like Airbnb, is taking a lot of places, and foreign investors are buying up a lot of property, a lot of the flats in London and other places in the UK. Like rural towns, rural fishing villages that we talked about just previously have had property being bought by foreign investment firms and being taken off the market, and not anything else being built there because they don't have really the space for it. And if more stuff gets built, that reduces the amount of value that those properties have. And so the investors aren't building there because they want to keep there and keep their investments and weather an economic storm in their home country, or, money launder, whatever the case may be. So the conservatives that are more populist thinking are like, I don't want these tax cuts. I want the economy to work for British people, whatever they may consider a person to be British, right? You got the spectrum, just like you got in the United States, right? You have out and out racist and civic nationalist, right? It goes across the spectrum. And I think that's probably more of the reason why her tax cuts had such a negative impact, at least politically speaking, if not economically speaking. Actually, what I want to understand is, politically speaking, because of the differences between neoliberal style conservatives and populist style conservatives, do you believe that the tax cuts issue is pushing for hurt her more politically, and that cascaded into some of the issues that we're seeing on the economic front? Or do you think this was purely political and people were going to want her to resign regardless of how it went economically?
Okay, that's a great question. I think this was a little bit of opportunism, but a little bit of the Brits, I don't think honestly have a clue how bad they have it. And no matter what happens, they're going to have a good almost decade of readjustment to go through. And that's without the political system. I'm talking economics. Truss actually kind of leaned in to the part where she really needs to, in the regard that I'm not going to say Britain needs austerity blatantly. What I do think is that Britain has a really weird balance between what the market does and what the state does. And it's been one of the most flippant, if you want to put it that way, governments regarding this. They have tried to privatize and unprivatize their railroads on an order of like 4 times. And sometimes they're like, hey, this works. Keep that private. Sometimes they're like, nah, this doesn't work. We can't keep it private. And it's literally down between like the major rail lines versus the local rail lines, and they're trying to figure out which ones work and which ones don't.
Right.
So the issue that
there, Ty. The worst thing to
Sure.
do is flip flop on policies.
Yes.
It's true.
It's literally worse to try something, try it back the other way, try back the other way. Like that's worse than almost doing nothing. Back to you.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And when it comes down to it, one, the Brits have a horrific pattern of being very flip floppy, and they know that their trains are incredibly important to them, not only economically but particularly politically. And that's why they're literally doing like Amtrak on steroids in some other regards. And then on another hand is that they know that there are business innovations that can be done within the British rail system that will absolutely pay for themselves. And that's a good conversation with like CSX over here and, you know, BNSF and what have you. They don't do much in the way of freight, but we do know that businesses can do rail very, very well. And they're just trying to figure out like, how do they do it? Because the Brits have been correct on one thing since Maggie Thatcher, and that is their government probably does way too much. And the more bureaucratic this government has gotten, the more that economic growth just continues to slow down. I absolutely agree with that. I know I'm more the right-wing guy on this particular panel, and I don't want to turn it overly into a debate, but like Britain, I think, shows the code here. Before World War II, Britain's one of the more free market economies in the world. They do get hit by the recession, but they're one of the first developed nations out of it. After World War II, they have a massive social spending program, and this is everything from NHS to their version of Social Security. And while it is, you know, the leftist paradise for a lot of other people, when it comes down to it, is that the Brits, they don't administer their system nearly as well as the French or the Germans when it comes to state intervention. It's very akin to what is throughout the rest of the Anglosphere. Government service is kind of seen as it's not very prestigious. It's not, you're not looked on as favorably as a prime minister or as a MP as you are a CEO. Very, very strong economic conservative traditions. Because of that,
that's probably the same in the United States.
Oh, I do. I absolutely agree with
100%,
that. The problem is, what I'm saying is that throughout most of Europe, though, that's not quite the case. Britain pioneers in a lot of terms laissez-faire economics. The Anglos, I'm just say like Anglos throughout the world largely have followed suit. The Americans to a large degree, the Canadians to some degree, the Aussies to some degree. And the more that we seem to get away from that, the more that our societies actually seem to buckle, because we don't put nearly enough emphasis on balancing our state traditions or our state policies along with that. And
I want to disagree with you there a little bit.
I'm sure you will. Go ahead.
Well, no, it'll be a slight one, and then right back to you. I would say that doing that, try one thing, try the other thing, try the other thing. Like, we're not doing laissez-faire, but we're also not doing like state intervention. We're just kind of like waiting until some shit goes wrong, and then we're like throwing a couple trucks from Fort Knox at it, and then we wait until shit goes wrong again. So like I'm trying to say that like I think that we're in like the worst of all of the worlds, because we're not laissez-faire, we're not like state influence. We're just kind of like, okay, when something breaks, then we're gonna have to fix it. Back to you.
I don't necessarily disagree with that, and honestly, I think that elaborates more to my issue than anything. It's not that we can't pick a side; it's that, moreover, we don't have the traditions that I would call like a civic tradition of like, hey, look, when you go into government, this is what is expected of you. And more particularly, it's prestigious. The Germans are very, very like a good example of this for me, is that the Germans, while are a little bit more economically conservative than the rest of Europe, have a very, very strong tradition of when you go to office, you have a very specific job, and you are evaluated strongly upon how well you do that job. People like Angela Merkel is renowned throughout Germany because she's freaking awesome. She does really, really well, or she did, right? And because of that, it was placed upon her that she is an all-star within Germany, right? Because Germany doesn't just look at it as business gets together with your local representatives to, build the factory and then you move on. It's business, labor, and the government all come together and they budget every single year. This is what your tax rate's going to be. This is what labor's cut is. This is how much your commodities are going to cost. And this is, ironically enough, while I'm praising Germany, is kind of what's being their problem this year. Every one of their forecasts got blown up because of the invasion. But go ahead.
When did Germany make it that any company of more than 500 people has to have 45% of their board of directors come from the workers? And I think it's almost 10% ownership of the companies also. When did that happen, and how did they enforce that mechanism?
I can't speak to where that started, but what I can speak to is that the Germans had something horrific happen to them in the fact that it was the World Wars, and they have been rebuilding their economy ever since. Remind you that not only did you have to face the World War, but you also had the Cold War and East Germany being split off. The Germans have had to reinvent themselves almost constantly over the last 70 years, because once West Germany really got stabilized, the moment that finally happens in the 80s, what happens? East Germany gets bolted on, and you can literally still see today on a satellite image of Berlin the dividing line, because they still use different lights.
Yeah, that's true. To answer your question, Touring News, it happened in 76. I just
Okay.
Googled
1970.
it.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's something like that. But the idea of this goes back further. They started tinkering with this as an idea and a concept starting in 1848.
Oh,
So
okay.
this probably could be a more cultural.
There's an amazing
stuff.
video out there by Richard Werner. He was one of he wrote The Princes of the Yen. He was in Japan when they invented quantitative easing. He's known for writing about credit creation theory of banking, but he often promotes the German banking system as they're a very regional banking system, correct? They don't really do the large global systemic important banks in the same way that the US economies do. Meaning, like, I think that they have like 1, 2, or 3,000 kind of smaller regional banks that actually maintain a relationship with their customers, rather than, like we all go to JP Morgan or Wells Fargo or so forth. So there are some unique things about what they do. And, as we get further into these banking ideas, maybe we'll have to look into how German banking is different, because he promotes their way of doing it as like the superior way just by far in reducing systemic risk.
I just the only problem here is that I was using this as a compare and contraction to Britain, which is our episode today.
Yeah.
I didn't want to deep dive too much on Germany, but
it's fair.
I'll just wrap this up by, from what I understand, Germany literally has like 3 different levels of banking. You have what I would call like their international wing, which is largely done through Luxembourg and ironically through the Swiss. A lot of these are literally like German people who run these banks, right? So you have Zurich, you have Luxembourg, and then you have the greater regional bank, which largely was Frankfurt. Frankfurt, for some reason, has always had a very strong banking system throughout a lot of like the last 300 years of Germany. And even after World War II, they were just able to rebuild it and keep it on going. It does get down to some regional banks, but I can't speak to that. That's just completely out of my depth zone at that point. But I do know that the Germans take banking very, very seriously. Deutsche Bank is incredibly renowned as being one of the most transparent but decently operating banks in the world. I know that's a bit of a meme this last year.
I mean, it was a meme in 2008. It was a meme in 2013. It was like Deutsche Bank is as memed as hard as like the euro is not going to last. Like it's the literal widow. Like I was reading about the widowmaker trade in Japan of shorting Japanese government bonds. But yeah, this is another widowmaker. Like, is Deutsche going to make it? Of course, they always make it some.
So that's the thing for me, is that like everyone has preached like doom on Deutsche Bank, and then every time that turns around, that's just like Deutsche Bank's doing the best. It's funny, but this actually does show for me the difference between like the Brits and the rest of Europe, is that the Brits just do very hands-off banking. It's one of the reasons that they have been renowned for the banking that they've had. It's why a lot of people wanted to do business within London. Right. And I think the issue here is, and I got to go global again, but this is also the legacy that the British have. London was built up because it was a global empire. And that global empire was built off of industrialization and the fact that the Brits kept coming into knife fights with guns. And so they were able to literally walk into entire sections of the world. What is it? Out of the modern countries today, only 12 of them have not been invaded by the Brits in the last 500 years. So yeah, the long and the short here is that the Brits were able to come in and establish a worldwide trading empire, and London became the financial center of the world. Eventually, they got surpassed largely by New York because of the fact the American economy got stupidly huge. Reminding you, the United States economy was the biggest in the world by like 1890 or 1900, right? So the Brits had this issue too, where they had this empire. They were still the second biggest trading bloc in the world, and then the empire took a crap, right? Parts of it were slower at first. You had India kick out literally as soon as the war was over, but most of the empire writ large didn't actually get formal independence until the mid 60s. At that point, London was in a lot of hurt. But what happens in 1973? London is bolted into the European Union, and London becomes the major banking center for the entire EU. That lasted until really today, because EU had Brexit and they couldn't ever negotiate the terms. And right before everyone was just right to call it quits, COVID happened and everything got put on hold. But now we've had a number of issues come up to where these conversations have to be had. And you had Liz Truss, which was, hey, look, I want to rework the tax code. We'll work on how we're going to spend money or figure out we're going to pay for everything later. But we need a far more business-centric government. We're going to lower taxes. We're going to get people back to work, that whole kind of thing. And it blew the market up, just blew it up. And I think the reality here, and this is my opinion, is that globally, Britain has still acted like the major banking center that it never has been since really like the 1950s. But London has been able to keep that rolling. And now, at the same time, the Zurich is leaving because they've now thrown away their neutrality. London is no longer bolted into anybody except Britain, and everyone is leaving. And I don't think the Brits have remotely woken up to the idea of that. Brexit
this ties
killed
into
London.
what you were talking about. Do you like Cypher or CSP? What do you want to be called?
Cypher's fine.
Okay. You were talking about how like money is moving from this market to that market or from that market to this market. I really think one of the biggest ways for people to understand what's currently happening in the world is anybody who's rich enough to invest wherever they want to is scouring the planet at all times, being like, oh, okay, land is cheap in the United States or land is cheap in Spain or so forth. Like we've moved into like such an ease of global transaction to like call up an international real estate person that you'd really, I'm going to get this wrong, but it's probably not much more expensive for me to buy property in Portugal than it is for me to buy property in the United States. Again, I can't entirely prove that. But to what Ty is talking about, like now that once the exits are seen, that like people are starting to walk through them, everybody tries to flood through those exits all at once. And that's a bit of what's happening in the UK, I think that you would agree with.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I don't know if you caught the question I asked Tiberius prior to being pulled in here, but the thing I asked him was basically, did he think that the economy started to kind of like do this whipsaw of what it, being tanked and being rescued by the UK central bank because of what Truss was doing, or do you think it was more, or do you think the Truss was only basically doing this and she was receiving political fallout, and what she didn't have much of an impact, and people would want her to resign regardless?
The United Kingdom was on fire. I take the lens that many of these things that are happening are inevitabilities. All that you can really do is like you can like put flame retardant on it to like slow it down for maybe 6, 12, 18 months. Or you can put accelerant on it to speed it up by 6, 12, 18 months. I think the Truss added accelerant to it. But I think, but I mostly take the lane that like, I mean, their currency was sliding before she came in. Their pension crisis was having a crisis before she came in. So like, did she exacerbate it? Did she like, make it happen faster? Yeah, of course. Similar to how we were talking about like COVID the other day. Did COVID accelerate the global sovereign debt crisis? Yes. Did it cause it? No, it's a big influence. It's a big impact towards it. It's a big way of speeding up that processes from unfolding. But I take the lane that it would have unfolded either way.
Okay. And do you think that even if it didn't have an accelerant factor on the crashing of the UK economy, that people would still be wanting her to resign simply because, as the title of this podcast alludes to, that conservatives, a large portion of the Conservative Party within Britain, and this goes globally because everything's interconnected, are done with Thatcher, Reaganism, etc. Neoliberalism is dying off to a degree within conservative politics? Or do you think that it's only the accelerant and the fact that the economy went to shit pretty much as soon as she came on board that people are like, no, she has to go and we don't want this to happen anymore?
I am not smart enough to answer that. I've fallen out of favor with like this kind of coverage. I don't know what has been going on. So yeah, no answer.
Okay. And so, Tiberius, there was, before I asked this question, you were wanting to get into the weeds on kind of more of the banking crisis that was happening, or was it the interest and everything amalgamation of that, or was there another thing that you wanted to talk about prior to continuing on with the main subject?
Well, actually, largely what I wanted to get into was the stuff that I just covered, and the fact that I don't think that people, particularly the Brits, have realized that their banking system was goaded up by the fact that they were either bolted into what used to be their former empire, which is now absolutely gone, or they were bolted into the European Union. And once they had Brexit, that was pretty much over. If they had made a deal to where they were going to still be the financial sector for Europe, maybe that still could have turned out okay, but it's too late now. I think it's over. Now, does that mean that Brexit was still the wrong choice? That could probably be a massive debate between all of us. I have very, very low hopes for Europe, even with the unity from them that I have seen this year. Europe has probably about 10 different issues across the compass that can kill it. And the fact that the idea that they're going to handle all of them is incredibly a high bar for me to clear. Doesn't mean they can't, but they're going to have to do some very specific things to make that happen, in my mind. So I'll leave it with that.
I think what a lot of the inability to connect, or the disconnect in the modern mind is looking back through history, learning from it, using it in our tools and modeling, but realizing that like we don't live in the same society even as like a couple of years ago. Like a lot of times I feel from the elder classes and like the politicos of the day that they're trying to use ideas and solutions that may have been viable in the 1990s, the 2000s, or so forth. But
Sure.
we're in a new decade and a new century of crises, and we're in a new economic system and style. Everybody could probably say like when quantitative easing was developed, that was like a new system. And so like how Ty was talking about how like the Brits are stuck in yesteryear. I'm trying to make that into a larger point that I think many of our leaders are kind of stuck in this yesteryear style of thought and not understand. It was interesting. The one United Kingdom guy came out and he said a lot of the quiet stuff out loud. He said, we're in an exponential age where everything happens faster than it's ever been happening. The only reason why the European Union was working was because of, and I'm not even really paraphrasing this one. He said, the European Union worked because of cheap Russian gas, and Chinese workers did more for inflation than our central banks ever could have. Like literal, almost quote for quote.
True.
It is. I mean, it is. So like some people are beginning to wake up that like their style of thinking is not going to lead us out of where we're at the moment. However, I do not think that the United Kingdom is one of those places where, they still have kind of staunch, aged ideas.
So I guess that means that we should start talking about sovereign debt crises then, huh? How this all parlays into everything else?
Yeah, Tiberius knows my thoughts on it, as do you, and as does Paul, but I'm happy to continue to be my parrot, that when you throw treats at me, I speak. I was just thinking the other day, like, I've covered this thing for like a year and a half or so, and like, Brent Johnson, the one who was like really one of the pioneers of this thesis, has said, like, this doesn't end well for anybody. I don't want to be right. This is pain for the whole world. So as you were.
So for the people that may not know that watch this, what we're talking about is the fact that pretty much across the entire global economic system, all governments everywhere have made, and not just governments, but investment firms, institutions, individual people, because they were operating on a system that worked, that has since been broken or is in the process of breaking. Depends on where you want to chop it up there. But what we're basically seeing is that there is a ton of debt. This is a layman's term, ton of debt out everywhere, and there's no way to pay it all off. Is that, Brad, would you say that's a good summation of it, or would you want to correct any of that like layman's term?
Yeah, no, that's that's a good part. I was just in my background here, I'm trying to look up some actual data for capital flight from emerging markets. That's going to tie in importantly to this kind of problem, which is like, I don't know which one. I don't know if that's the chicken or if that's the egg, but it is. They're both as equally important.
Okay, and because of the fact that there's not enough ways to pay off all this debt, for whatever in various forms there's not enough, not liquidity, but there's not enough places to do good investment to make a return in order to pay off those debts, you're going to have this cascading problem of basically a vicious cycle where one default happened leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. It's similar to what happened in 2008, but without a tool really to fix it, because instead of it being mortgage-backed securities and derivatives causing contagion, it's just the system itself rotting. Would you say that that's also basically what's going on, Brad?
As long as this isn't like too hard of information for people to hear, then yes, I mostly agree with all this. Yes.
So I think that summarizes it fairly well then. Brad, I want you to go first, and then Tiberius, I want you to give your thoughts about this. But Brad, why do you think this is happening, and why do you think the UK situation that just happened in the last 2 weeks, which led to Liz Truss resignation, is indicative of this problem that we just summarized, rather?
Yeah, usually, from my understanding of global finance, let's call it the deeper your market is, meaning like the bigger the number is, an economy that's a $2 trillion economy versus a $1 trillion economy. The $2 trillion economy should have economic problems after the $1 trillion one. That's a little bit about how I'd be talking about like the depth of an economy. So from my understanding is typically emerging markets and developing markets exhibit these debt crises problems. You had the 1997 Southeast Asian currency crisis. You've had currency crises in Argentina, Brazil, so many places over so many different periods of time. Typically, it does not hit home in what was once considered and or still is imperial core countries. I usually talk in this style to help people understand that if these kind of problems are showing up in one of the more liquid bond markets in the world, United Kingdom gilts or Japanese government bonds or United States treasuries and so forth. That usually means that if we looked through Pakistan, if we looked through Armenia, if we looked through Turkey or any other countries, something similar would have already happened to them. And kind of what happened to the United Kingdom is due to the concept of 0% interest rate in order to continue the growth that was required from 2013 to 2021. Governments kept putting out very cheap access to sovereign debt, which was very good for their current account balances and their current ability to finance whatever type of spending that they wanted to do within their sovereign country. However, as many people said back in those times, okay, well, now that the zero interest rate is here, really one of the main tools, one of the 9 tools that the central banks around the world have to engage in order to correct any kind of economic disturbances would be the raising of interest rates. The problem is if a government raises interest rates from 0 to 3% in a year, but they were issuing debt at 0% for 6 years, any poor sap that thought that it was a good idea to put that in their pension or put that as part of their 401k portfolio is now finding it's more or less been rendered unable to sell. So the Bank of England went in and they put in like a $65 billion bid for some of what I would call those toxic assets in order to prevent every single person from trying to sell their Pokemon Charizard at the same exact time, more or less. And when you researched the 2008 Lehman Brothers crisis, when you researched the beginning of the COVID-19 2020 March crisis, when you research current crises, it's never really a problem that things crash and go to zero. It's more of a problem that everybody is trying to use the fire exit all at once. And either the fire exit is shut because nobody wants to buy your toxic stuff, or there's so little on the other side of it that nobody can liquidate the positions that they're trying to do. So I guess it's almost as important to understand that it means that there isn't a buyer out there for the assets. Not that the assets are completely zero or worthless. It's more of just there's nobody that wants to be the holder of them at the current moment.
Now the question I would have for that then is like, yeah, sure, they made a bad bet, right? Because right now their value is essentially zero or negative, essentially, right? It's not it in terms of where inflation is, the returns they got on that government debt or whatever debt it was that they bought, that's the case, right? That's why there's nobody there to buy it.
Yeah, like so if I put $1,000, I'm just gonna make numbers
is
rather
fine.
easy. So if I put $1,000 into a United Kingdom bond in 2019 at 0.5%, and so now I have 3 years left on this bond. It still has like the coupons on it and so forth. If I try to go sell that into global markets, instead of them offering me the 1,000 that I put into it and a bit of interest, since markets at the moment can buy current issued
Mhm.
10-year government debt at 4% interest, they might only offer me $700 and I
Right.
invested 1,000. So maybe you're down like 30%. Maybe it's 800, maybe it's 600 or so forth. But when two things, when bonds are supposed to be the safe part of your portfolio and not really get you losses or gains, it's really just supposed to like be your protection. And when governments leveraged, or I'm sorry, when pension funds leveraged so many times by buying a bond, putting it up for collateral, taking the cash, buying another bond, putting it up for collateral. This is why hedge funds blow up. This is why pension funds blow up. Like when you lever up to, even if it's, let's say you even lever up 10x, that means that a 10% reversal in any of your bets could deem your entire fund illiquid if you get margin called. So like adding leverage into financial wizardry really just means that small reversions or small losses can magnify into these attempted liquidation events.
So I'm gonna be honest. I understood like 90% of that, but my problem is that I don't understand. No, I understand why someone would need to protect against margin calls and why that could cause a cascading effect on this. What I don't understand is why they have a margin call on it at all. Do you like? I don't understand why they had this supposedly safe asset, and really they're going to get their money back in a little bit. It's going to be because inflation, it's going to be eaten away a bit. But why would this make it to where they need to liquidate it for their margin to protect against their margin positions? Is it because they're just betting on top of bets on top of bets? Because that's what it sounds like.
Ty, do you want to try here to help or?
Oh, well, you had to do that to me, didn't you?
'Cause, I mean, I think I can do so. Like, okay, in the United States, this is actually a key thing, and this is something that Tiberius hit on a little bit. In the United States, you're not allowed to rehypothecate treasuries in the
Right.
same way that you are in the London banking system. So,
And
or
just
like in the international banking system. Like putting okay, I could buy $1,000 government debt from King Tiberius of the United Kingdom, and then I can go loan that to somebody on a 30-day time window, get my $1,000 of cash back, go back to King Tiberius once again, buy another bond, put it back into the market, and so this is kind of one of the ways that they've leveraged their balance sheets and their portfolios in order to try to get returns. So the problem of getting into, quote, the margin call event would be, let's say that Grandma Eileen wants to retire and Grandma Eileen wants to begin liquidating her portfolio in order to move it from bonds and equities into cash. When Eileen tries to sell and her bonds go for like 80 cents on the dollar, I'm not smart enough to know if this is what happens, but there are accounting principles that force banks to declare losses and or gains at certain parts.
Mhm.
So somehow there is a way that if you have to report X amount of losses and your losses are above that 10 to 1 leverage that you did or so forth, like if you have $100 and you leverage it up to $1,000 for your investments, all that has to happen is any one of your 10 different bets to lose $100, to then you have to sell off every single bet that you have in order to try to cover the losses on like your leveraged balance sheet. I'm not doing the perfect job of this one, so I'll give it back to Ty.
No, I think I got it. Ty, do you want to expound upon it a little bit more?
Do I want to? Not really.
Not particularly.
Not really. No. Like the banking system is weird, and quite honestly, I'll just put it in this regard. Every time I talk to people in banking, I hear 1,000 different things. I got people on one side saying U.S. Treasuries are going to crash literally by the end of the year, and it's over. And then you got other people. It's just like, look, we're gonna reshuffle a few things, but the Fed will, if the Fed needs to do QE again, they will. At the same time, it's doing like quantitative easing, or sorry, I can't talk. at the same time that they're doing interest rate hikes. Like, I don't get it. Like, everyone tells me something different, to be honest. What I can say, what I know definitively, is that we really don't have a clue anymore. I honestly believe that most people have no idea what's going on. There's a few people that are far more right than others, but I don't know these people. I honestly don't. Everyone has such a bad track record that I've looked into regarding this kind of issue, and the only thing that I will say affirmatively is that if there was ever a lesson to be learned from 2008, we didn't learn it.
Okay, so everybody's Peter Schiff, basically.
Yeah, like literally, he was the guy that I had in mind. I don't want to completely like just be but yeah, I'm not super impressed. And while there are some people that that do talk to me, and if y'all ever hear this, like this is not any targeted at anyone in particular. It's just one of these deals where I hear a lot of forecasts and like, I'm an expert, I know what I'm doing, and I'm like, that's wonderful. But when I check like what they've said in the past, more often than not, if I can find a record of it. Some people have a little bit better accuracy than others, but when it comes to the major calls, nobody's right. Like there was very few people who called 2008 before it happened. And most of those were people that were within the housing industry. And remind you, it's literally 2007 when this fires off. President Bush is still in the White House, and the CEO of Lehman Brothers at the time walks into the Oval Office and says, "Hey, look, you've got 72 hours before Lehman Brothers literally goes belly up. And you have a cascading default throughout the entire system." And shockingly enough to me, Bush knew and said, "Hey, I would love to help you with this, but I can't. That's literally Congress's job. So let me call a special session of Congress." And, it wasn't much longer before we had, the first TARP?
Yeah.
Legislations go through. I can't keep track of this industry. And it's not just the fact of everything that you see on the front. Does anyone know how to do a derivative? Anyone here know by chance?
Well, how to do it? I understand it in concept.
Yeah, I can understand.
I can put the assets in that are required to make a derivative. I can help you find there. Yeah, like there was a weird day where I knew about collateralized debt obligations. Collateralized debt obligations are more or less like, let's say that we take 27 different business loans and we tie them all together. And then we turn that into a CDO. What I don't know,
on top of it,
right? What I don't remember though is there's also collateralized debt obligations squared, which is like
fuck.
I don't remember if it was like you bundle different CDOs together to try to make it. So I mean, mainly like your question, Ty, is like there is no way to understand the massive derivatives market that would be out there.
And that's a core thing. I've literally been told, and at least by the things that I can look into when it comes to banking is, what is it? Something on the order like 40% of all worldwide wealth right now is tied into derivatives. And they're like, whether that's true or not, I'm not going to remotely know, because everyone that I've talked to who's supposed to be able to check can't check. And so for me, I'm looking at a system that is built to be opaque and openly is doing the same things that consistently gets them in the trouble. You know what? When it comes to banking, let the populace rise up. If something has to happen to the bankers, fine. Because I'm sorry, numbers and accounting are not complicated. It's not. It's a lot of work. Accounting is a pain in the ass if you want to be, very blank about it. Blatant, excuse me. But the long and the short is that if you give me a couple hours, I should be able to figure out, are you solvent or not, even if you're a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. And there is entire auditing and account firms that can't go through these banks. That tells me something is horrifically wrong with our system. Forget us. What about the Brits? Because now London's in free fall. Because this is still a British episode.
No, yeah,
London is in breaking free fall right now. And I don't think they're going to find the bottom in the next 2 years. You are going to see a pound that is worth 80 cents when this is over.
To say it again to people as like how to explain it. Teacher Timmy and janitor Jane were all told by their financial advisors that it's very wise of you to have 30% of your money funding the United Kingdom government by buying United Kingdom long-term debt. This is how most countries and most people build their investment portfolios. Well, now Teacher Timmy and janitor Jane are being called by their same financial advisors and saying, if you try to sell what we told you to buy for the past 5 or 6 years, we can't find a person to buy it for you. So you either are willing to put it out there for whatever people are going to give you, which is not going to be anything that's going to make you happy, or you have to hold off on your redemption in order for us to try to figure out like a way to prevent this gaping loss that is coming out of your retirement money. So the people that are mostly being hit by the UK bond problems are once again Teacher Timmy and Janitor Jane, because they're the ones that can't really afford to handle those losses.
And just for a point of clarity here, in case people that watch this don't understand, by redemptions, Touring News is saying selling it on the open market to liquidate it now, not that because there's still a coupon, so it still has anywhere between, depending on when they bought it, anywhere between 10 and 20 years left on it before it gets fully redeemed.
And then a problem for when many of you know downward goes a lot faster than upwards. Like selling begets selling. Okay, GME aside, AMC aside, but selling begets selling faster than buying begets buying. Meaning the concept of a debt deflation spiral lightly goes, if your populace is spending more of their disposable income on the necessities, rent, water, food, childcare, internet, and so forth. The higher percent of income that number rises, the less percent of income that you have in order to spend on discretionary and consumer goods. So if Teacher Timmy's family was spending 60% of their money on those things before, but now due to inflation via both rent, food, and energy costs, now they're spending 80%, two things might happen. One, they might not even spend that other 20% on consumable items because they're going to be like, well, shit, like we need to save. Maybe I need to like start saving all of my money now if times are going to continue to get worse. And or they do spend that little bit, but it doesn't do as much velocity of money and circulation in the economy as it did before. So the reason that Neil Kashkari, Fed Central Bank Minneapolis chair, came out and said deflation is worse than inflation. And the reason that you hear most people in the financial world say deflation is worse than inflation is because as portfolio values go down and a majority of middle class citizens in all nations have investment portfolios, it's going to be called what is paper rich. If I have a 401k portfolio and it says it's worth $200,000, but then 4 months later, it's only worth $170,000. That can impact my current day-to-day spending. So it's a thing in the United States, called like, depending on how much your investments are worth is how much money you're going to spend at the moment. So if you have back-end unrealized losses, even though it's not accessible money to you, it instills fear within you. And fear means you're going to spend less, you're going to save more. So mostly, nobody ever wants us to save anything. Saving, in a very simple terms, I'm not against saving, but in the way that the economy works, if we all saved, the world economy would shut off. The world economy works because we spend into it, we keep the velocity of money going, we keep goods and services flowing. But if we all became savers all at one time, then you would go faster into those deflationary spirals.
Yes, there's one key issue here, and this is where I about lose my collective crap when it comes to spending money. Saving is not active expenditures, it's passive expenditures in the regards that you save up an amount of money for a given amount of time and then you drop it all at one time on something, right? So that could be a house, that could be a car, and it, just because we're going to do loans, sometimes you're not buying the car outright, but you might drop 30 to 50% of it. That's not a bad thing, and actually that's where you get a lot of spending in durable goods. This is where I'm sitting here thinking like, we've done a really bad job of incentivizing saving. It's not that you want to just slow the market down to the point where you have everyone buying durable goods, but it's to the point where how many people have credit card debt now? How many people have, can barely afford their houses? Like, we do not provide an environment to keep ourselves from being over leveraged. And now with inflation, I feel like we're just going to hit the end of here.
Well, isn't that a combination of lifestyle attainment, wishful attainment, wish fulfilling, as well as not being paid enough? Because if your paycheck goes up only 3%, but inflation is 10%, well, you just took a 7% pay cut.
Right. So like that's the income side. I don't want to dissuade from that. Income side is a huge deal, particularly, like I'm the guy who's like free trade might not have been a good idea. That's a whole other conversation.
Right.
But the other side of this is that the expenditure side is that this is where a lot of people who are like, oh, free market this, free market that, I distance myself from, because their entire idea is using Keynesian economics and the multiplier effect, where it just spin, keep the average propensity to save as low as possible. If people are taking out credit card debts just to pay for what they're continuing to do, that's okay because the economy is going and people have jobs. It's almost like the West has done a light or has slowly trended more towards a bit of throughput economics to keep a lot of these trends going. And I'm kind of surprised that we haven't gone full circle with some of these already.
Can you ask your question again, Cypher? Because I didn't actually fully agree with your reasoning. So if you could ask that one more time, that way I can.
So yeah, so Tiberius was essentially saying that we don't save enough as a culture.
Right.
And I said that there's also the income side of that house where you can't necessarily save if you're not making enough money, and then used inflation as an example.
I think that in speaking about those two, it puts the blame on corporations and I don't know, somebody else, but I kind of want to bring the blame back to banks and or central banks, and I'll explain why. The savings rate has been pressed down and down and down and down purposefully over time to make saving, even if you earn enough money, an unattractive option.
Yes.
You know, if you look at the rate that you can get on a CD or even like government debts or so forth, there has been a concerted global-wide effort to, my opinion, and this is something I talk about often, is we have all been pushed out the risk curve further and further and further. This is why price-to-earnings ratios got out of control and skyrocketed in equities values. This is why people flooded so much money into Pokemon cards, into used video games, into cryptocurrency, into anything. Like the ability to find a adequate rate of return as central banks lowered interest rates, made it less for you to just have a standard savings, less to just have standard bonds and so forth. This was all a I don't think that it was a cabal that had like this concept of doing it, but the consequence of their actions of moving interest rates down over such an extended period of time, you know, it was 1992 to 2020, kind of like, you know, downward curve, easily noticeable. This has forced us to not save because, as you're saying, you know, you're either barely keeping afloat with inflation, because inflation in that time, at least in the UK or in the West, wasn't as bad as it is now. So yeah, it kind of like said, well, okay, even if inflation is only 2%, why do I want to have my money in a bank CD at 0.5%? You know, well, everybody just tells me buy the indices, the stock markets are always going to go up. So my agreement, but my disagreement is like we've been societally and planet-wide so far pushed out the risk curve, and now we're kind of like finding out what are some of the consequences of that.
No, I agree with that too. I just didn't mean to say that it's not.
I wanted to get that part added in because I really think that understanding this being pushed out the risk curve helps people understand why nobody wants to go into Pakistan with money at the moment. Like why nobody wants to go in and kind of like fix things, because they're just looking at it being like it's not there was an interesting piece from this article that I just read. Okay, the exit of foreign investors was no flight to safety. It was a flight out of investments that seemed attractive when access to cheap capital was guaranteed by the unconventional monetary policies that had been adopted by developed countries' central banks ever since the global financial crisis of 2008. And this is saying that according to the Institute of International Finance, between March and June of 2022, $30.1 billion flowed out of emerging and developing market equities markets with flows into debt instrument. God.
No, wouldn't that be because we started to increase interest rates to a degree, and then it went from risk markets to safe markets that could actually provide a return?
Yeah, correct. Because now the flight out of investments that seemed attractive when there was access to cheap capital is no longer there. So that's it ties that directly.
So let's loop all this back around to the UK, right? Because that's what this episode is about, but it's about everything, because that's how this program is working, right? That's what I want this program to do. Everything is connected. Nothing is separate. It all folds in on itself. So Tiberius, earlier in the show, said that something along the lines of like the UK was still a financial powerhouse. It was, the stock market of the world, essentially, right, of Europe. It's been disentangled from that, and now the world is experiencing what that disentanglement means. Brad comes in and we talk about sovereign debt crises and the ability of people to make investments, yada yada yada, and everything cascading and breaking from that. Those two are linked. Right? So what does it mean for the UK when you have, on the one hand, it used to be connected, used to be welded together with the world economy. Now it's been breaking apart due to debt crises, the Brexit, etc., and losing its position of dominance within financial sectors. And what does it mean for the UK? Because with that breaking off and then also suffering from foreign debt crisis, where's it going to go?
I want to jump in on this one. Okay, so I think Tiberius would actually, you'll agree with where I go with this. In yesteryear, if your currency began to slide a little bit, it was kind of rather okay because you had some exports that were going to make up for it. Like the way that international currencies are supposed to balance out with one another is if yours loses X% of value over X period of time, then anything that your country manufactures is going to be cheaper and easier to afford in the international community, and therefore it's going to kind of balance itself back out. Would you agree that that's kind of how it was supposed to work, Tiberius?
More or less, yes.
Okay. Well, a problem for the United Kingdom is I don't think that they've manufactured anything since like 1910. So,
Lol.
So they don't really like have the way of protecting them. Like a lot of nations are now finding themselves in a completely globalized world where they've exported a lot of their manufacturing, or they're heavily reliant on this import to make that export, or so forth. That the defense mechanism of having a depreciating currency was, all right, we're just going to ramp up our manufacturing, and that's going to get us out of it because our businesses are going to do better. Maybe luxury imports are going to get a little bit more expensive, but who cares about that? Well, the problem that the United Kingdom now has is, again, they haven't manufactured anything since 1910. So they don't have a natural defense mechanism to prevent this continued further slide of depreciation of their pound. And as the pound depreciates further, their energy import bill gets higher. As their energy import bill gets higher, their cost of manufacturing, heating, and everything gets higher. So they found themselves in the worst of all scenarios, which is it seems to be they're going to slowly slide towards like top tier developing economy status, because if you're a service-based economy, if you're a financial services-based economy, or a National Institute of Health-based economy, you are not sending anything out of the world or out of your country. Therefore, you're going to continue to stagnate. So they've got demographic problems. They've got all sorts of types of problems. But what the problem that they really have, and the biggest problem that they don't have, is they don't have a way to stop this depreciation. So I think that they're in a bad way.
Empire and its consequences, am I right?
Yes, very much. Yeah, if anybody read Ray Dalio's book, The Changing World Order, it was like a 500-year analytical research of global powers, global reserve currencies, and kind of the trend that they take. And it's always the currency that goes last. Usually kind of like what's happening with the United States at the moment right now. Like, we are obviously an empire in decline. To what level of decline? That's up for debate.
We are?
But
Wait, news to me. Okay.
Some might actually disagree. But anyway, it's always the money that is the last one to go out of all of the things that you have power over. Usually, like, the banking system is the one that lasts the longest.
Fair enough. So, Tiberius, is there anything that you disagreed with what Brad was saying, or anything you want to add to it?
Like, I agree with 90% of it. All right. There's a little nuance and details that I always could go into, but like, Brad knows his stuff. And what it comes down to is a lot of economic models were a little questionable before we got to 2020. And Brad hit it very well in that, all right, cool. You know what? If you have a manufacturing base, but it's uncompetitive because you have a strong currency, and you're just importing some of this cheap stuff. Oh, well. because in the event that your currency goes under, is that all of a sudden you have a reason to build out. But that was 40 years ago. Like, and I don't like literally. I don't want to dissuade from that. Most of the West has openly deindustrialized. Like, say what you will about Germany, but like Britain, the only reason that Britain has been able to keep its carbon emissions relatively stable is they import everything. Everything that's pretty much a refined good or a finished good comes from outside of the country. Europe does more of the assembly for Britain than the Brits do. And the Brits are a natural gas and oil supplier. And they're still not even doing it in their own country.
The only reason that Germany didn't deindustrialize is because they were able to hide their strong currency inside of the euro.
Part one, that. Part two is that the Germans have had a really, really strong ability to marry the interests of the state, the labor, and the business all into one. They do really good at doing a yearly meeting, getting everybody in the same room, and figuring out what they need to do.
I understand what we've been trying to tell people, that rather than having businesses compete with every business, you can kind of, for better or worse, have countries compete with countries. And when you unify the power of the three things that you were talking about in like a strong forward way, you can get a lot done.
Yes, but just to show you what the...
I was just going to say China has learned the same lesson, and now maybe is forgetting it. That's the kicker. China and Germany are great examples of where that system goes wrong. Yeah. And I'm glad we got here. That system goes wrong whenever whoever is taking the spear tip is wrong about something. And I mean critically wrong. The Germans have been critically wrong in the fact that they were way too reliant on Russian energy, and that was never going to be a threat. And what's worse is that they kind of knew that, and they doubled into solar, which just doesn't work that well in Germany. I'm sorry, it really doesn't.
This will be one that you like, Cypher.
Yeah.
The biggest strength of every country seemingly always becomes their greatest weakness at the end.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's kind of where the United Kingdom is finding itself. That they were great at all of this power projection. They were great at the banking and everything like that. But now their problem is they've got none of it. So what was their biggest strength before is now they're depleted dead carcass weakness.
Yeah, it's the albatross around their neck at this point, right?
Yeah. I don't dissuade from any of that. And what really goes here is that Britain now has to figure out what its place in the world is. And I'm going to just put it in this regard: Britain's going to have to reinvent itself. And this is something that I have talked about for a couple of years now. The reality for Britain is far more likely that they become an American colony before anything else. Laugh all you want.
I'm laughing because it's probably it's at least a little bit true.
I'm shocked that the Biden administration did not finish talks with the Brits on having a free trade deal. Britain is alone right now. There is no deals being struck with them. There's no one who finds them competent. And now that their economy is going full tilt, Britain looks like it's just going to go alone in the night. I don't think that'll happen, but it's going to take an administration either within their country to reach out and find a really willing partner, or it's going to take somebody who's going to have a vested interest in saving the Brits. The only people who can do that are the Americans.
Oh, come on, Russia. Come on, China. Jump in this. World War III, baby. Let's go. I'm kidding. No. This is a meme. This is a meme.
Yeah, I know. We've clearly found out that the Russians literally can't even save their own system. So I'm literally at the point now where I'm willing to write off the Russians as a viable state. I don't know if they're going to make it out of this decade. China, every time we turn around, is now showing signs that its system is horrifically hemorrhaging. And I didn't believe that this country was going to make it out of this decade before we entered this one.
And this is where we come back to the United States being the black hole, that we're just going to, yes. all of the people are going to be like, okay, Britain is broke in the sense of like broken. Sorry. China is broken. Russia is broken. Germany, so the problem.
Germany is deindustrializing because they can't afford the energy.
The black hole theory is all capital flows back into the United States. And I think that we could look, and I'll bet you it's rushing out of the United Kingdom. I'd love to find charts of capital flows out of UK markets. But I bet you that there are large, and I'll look for it.
Don't get me wrong. I get you. I'm 100% with you. The question is, the Brits are competent. They're not slouches. They're really damn good at being innovators. They're really good at moving things along. And while I have serious qualms about how much leftism has taken over within Britain, they're the least leftist country within Europe. They have the ability to reinvent themselves and reinvigorate themselves. They still have one of the strongest value-added chains in the continent. They still have an ability to punch above their weight, and they're critically supplied in something that is going to be very scarce within Europe, which is fuel. I'm not remotely ready to write off the Brits yet. I'm not even close. But this will probably be the most painful decade for the British people and the British state in the last 200 years. I put no emphasis on that absolutely being the case. What they do about it is going to be incredibly open, but I totally can see where it's going to be a big deal.
So I have 2 questions to follow up, but Brad, do you want to get something in first before I do the follow-up questions?
Yeah, okay. So I got a quote here from somebody, January 11th, 2022. Foreign investment in emerging market stocks and bonds outside China has come to an abrupt standstill over fears that many economies will not recover quickly enough from the pandemic this year. Non-resident flows to emerging markets reached 16.8 billion last month, compared with 13.7 billion in November, but 70.2 billion in December of 2020. So December 2020 was kind of like just before COVID had happened. But again, like I think that you're even going to see capital flows out of the United Kingdom, to try to keep it into like what the message is going to be. But you've got Janet Yellen saying she's worried about emerging market and developing market capital flows. You've got me saying it. You've got Nouriel Roubini. You've got people in the IMF and so forth. So like the powers that be are beginning to realize, oh shit, nobody is going to try to save Senegal.
Well, I mean, is it anybody's job to do it but Senegal? That would be the response from the more conservative minded, right? And if we're in a conservative,
yes, if these wonderful conservatives are willing to sit down with me and evaluate history from 1940 to 2022, and then they say that it's still only Senegal's problem, I will put up my white flag and throw in the towel. But I don't think that there are many. I don't think there are too many good faith people that can say, oh, it's just their problem. Even if you'll concede to me a little bit, like, okay, yeah, maybe some imperial countries had some kind of impact. Let's have a talk. That's good for me. But yeah, you had 2 questions.
Yeah, so I have two follow-up questions. So first, Tiberius is talking about that the UK has a lot of natural gas resource, right? The question I have for that one is that I know that the United States and the UK under Obama and a little bit under Obama and a little bit under Trump were looking at partnering with American companies to exploit some of those natural resources. Where's that part at now? Because I haven't been keeping up with it because the UK has been a shit show since Boris Johnson got elected, essentially, and hasn't been able to do anything, which might be why Biden hasn't tried to reach out yet, because it's still, waffling or whatever. And then the other question, which is kind of related to the industrial side of the house, is the UK doesn't have much space for a lot of industrialization. So is that wrong thinking on my end just because maps are bad, or do they actually have a state or a space problem that might prevent it from actually industrializing to the point that it needs to in order to save its own economy?
Let me check the second one first, because that one's an interesting one. Britain literally was the first country to industrialize, and while their economy has increased by quite a size, and their population has gone up quite a size as well, is that Britain's not overly developed. Like, don't get me wrong, like London's huge, right? You've got Birmingham, you've got Manchester, you've got Liverpool. These used to be the manufacturing powers of Britain. If you look at it on a satellite map, it doesn't look like Japan. It doesn't look like every ounce of arable land is taken up and that you can't do it. What the Brits are going to have to do, in my opinion, is if they're going to have a new industrial plant, one, they need a new business-friendly motto of actually interacting while also not screwing over their populace. And that's the trick everyone's going to have to figure out. Britain's demography isn't bad, but we don't know how many of those folks are like Romanians and Bulgarians and Hungarians who have come over to basically be cab drivers. Like, I don't want to meme here, and I don't want to like make that sound in a derogatory way, but that's largely what has happened.
The Poles do all the construction work.
Construction, plumbing,
Yeah.
etc. So yeah.
Literally, there's a big question. How many people,
Poland.
even without the Brits being in the Schengen area when they were part of the EU, is that a lot of Eastern Europeans fled to the Western Europe, and we know that changed the demography. We don't know how many people are traditional Brits versus how many people are from North Africa and Eastern Europe. There's probably some really good data on that one. I just don't have it. But the long and the short for me is that you're talking about a nation that is demographically at least okay. So, it's got a decent amount of young folks that you can educate, train up, and make into a viable economic structure. You got to have a balance between business and labor. The Brits never figured that one out. And then the second part is when they finally get that, they're going to have to figure out a brand new, entirely top to bottom logistics system. Because the issue with Britain is it's incredibly dense. And while they have, to some degree, walkable cities, there's not nearly the amount of commuting in Britain that you see here in the United States. But that's the issue. It's good when you import everything and everything moves one direction. But what happens when you've got workers moving one way and the stuff that they're going to buy is moving the other direction? Because they're going to work outside of town, and their stuff is coming inside of town to work. This is the problem that a lot of developing nations are trying to figure out. They haven't figured it out. The United States had a conversation about it whenever we built the interstate, but then we started offshoring, we started outshoring literally, 20 years into the interstate. So we never really answered the question ourselves, and now we have gridlock here in major cities as well. Logistics is going to be a massive issue. They really need to have a conversation about freight rail, because if there's any country in Europe that can do it, it's Britain, and they don't do it. And it drives me insane. Guys, freight and rail works. Why do you not do it, Europe? You beat us on
their rail system's even getting expensive now.
Yes, it is.
I was looking up like a ticket from Manchester to London. It's like $70.
It's getting a little wonky. Yeah, it's getting a little wonky in Britain. I'm not gonna lie, but they're gonna have to do a complete overhaul. But in all fairness, so does almost everybody else. Everybody has got a problem when it comes to dealing with a lot of these things, and I don't think that's going to end anytime soon. Sovereign debt crisis, industrial throughput, supply chains, everyone's kind of screwed.
And they also have a problem right now of the biggest benefit of them being inside the European Union was you could take produce from France and put it directly in the United Kingdom without having to go through a checkpoint. Now they are out of the European Union, you have to check all of everything that goes across the Port of Calais and underneath the Channel and so forth. So like when Brexit was really like developing, they were having huge backups of lorries and all of everything at the ports, because before, it's just easy cross of goods across the different borders. But now they're kind of struggling with that aspect as well, which they had to retool.
And then so the second question then is, the United States was in talks with the UK about using American technology in order to export the shale revolution to the UK. Do either of you have any updates about that? I don't know how much process that went through.
The UK banned fracking at some point.
Yeah, I think that's what I think happened. But because energy is a key issue right now, and they're not able to import the energy that they were getting from Russia because of Russia being a essentially, is that back on the table now, or will it be back on the table with the next conservative prime minister?
I'm actually going to put a no on this one, and it's not because the Brits wouldn't benefit to some degree on that technology. It's that almost anywhere that they could frack, they probably don't want to frack, and they've got a substantial amount of reserves that they can now tap due to the North Sea. So it is expensive. If they want to do fracking to the point where, they can go back onto the mainland and start working, that's fine. There's only a couple places you can do it, though, and I don't think the reserves are estimated to be that big. Britain, I don't expect to jump on board with that in any kind of major order, particularly in the fact that they've got a whole other list of issues that they really need to solve first. The country that actually does need to have a serious conversation about fracking is France. The issue with that is, one, they are incredibly pro-environmental, and the best places they could frack is literally run under Paris.
We are at about an hour and 40 minutes of streaming, so probably actually about an hour and a half of streaming. I like to keep it to about that. Are there any final thoughts either you would like to impart on this before we do a closeout?
I'm just going to repeat what I largely said earlier. Don't write off the Brits. The Brits have had challenges. The Brits have had some serious issues going in, but they either find a way to kind of keep the system loft up, or they find a way to completely reinvent themselves. I wouldn't even challenge them to do it again. I kind of expect them to do it again. Only if I'm going to be partisan as hell for a second here. Only if they embrace the horrible envy of leftism and completely just turn their country into a stagnant hellhole. The Brits can absolutely pull this off. And I honestly, I expect them to do it. If they don't do it, I mean, even if Scotland decides to kick out, Northern Ireland kicks out, and even Wales decides to kick out, England by itself still has something on the order of like 40 million people. It's a highly developed nation. It's pretty wealthy. And even if they don't have the mainstream banking that they have, they've got the best, so basically some of the best land and some of the best climate in all of Europe to really muster under their aegis. And so they've got the population, they've got the technology. They don't have the innovation nearly as much as they did, but they can get it from their friends if they want it. You know, there's a lot of room here for the Britain to rework itself in a lot of regards. So even if everything kind of goes to hell for them, I still expect that they'll make it through on the other side. They just will be unrecognizable to today. And they've done that before. Probably 3 times now, actually. Whether it be Spanish Armada, whether it be Industrial Revolution, and even to some degree post-World War II. So yeah, I think they'll be okay.
I guess the way that I'll end it would be I'm going to recommend some people that have taught me a lot of stuff. I learned a lot from Lynn Alden, from Nouriel Rubini, Michael Hudson, Mark Blythe, George Gammon, Jeff Snyder, Emil Kalinowski, Luke Groman, Brent Johnson. And I think that it's due time that we take some of our leisure time and repurpose it towards our both personal education and the education that we help others. You know, learning is always a process. You're teaching the teacher, the teacher's teaching you. So thank you earlier for the compliment, Ty, of saying, like, you know, Brad knows his stuff. I partly know my stuff because I spent a lot of time reading. And if anybody takes those names that I offered to you, I don't agree with any of them 100%. I don't disagree with any of them 100%. But if you begin to go through them, those are the people that have helped me gain some of my concept of what the tea leaves.
And to close out, thank you, Brad, for joining us today. Greatly appreciate it. You do know your stuff, and you're always a delight to be here when you're here. So if you ever want to come back to Cypher State, let me know. So to close out from my end, I think what we're going to see happen with the UK matters a lot where the leadership goes in the coming weeks. Whoever the new conservative leader is of Britain will have a stamp of somewhat of more approval than the last two, even if it's Johnson again, because there's been such a that's happened over the last 3 weeks that they're going to welcome this new person and they're going to do things that you, I, Tiberius, even Brad won't necessarily agree with, but it's going to leave a mark and it might actually have some positive impacts. So that's first thing. Second thing is I could very well see the UK being open to fracking again. They stopped it in 2019, but with Liz Truss's administration, they removed that ban, that total ban, and we're in exploratory talks with communities and in different groups and business interests to bring it to start it back up. So that's the thing that I think the next administration will very much continue on with, simply because energy prices are so high that they have to do something. And with that, there's also the fact that their pension system is under strain, and there's a couple of ways that they could potentially alleviate some of that pain, but what is going to matter is how they go about doing that, and who is going to take the brunt of the pain. With a conservative, more leaning government, unless they are a populist leaning conservative government, the pain is likely going to be felt most by people that are on the bottom economic strata. But with the way that things have gone, and even Liz Truss removing Thatcher's ghost from her body at the last couple of weeks of maintaining energy price controls and things like that, Maybe it won't be. Maybe finally the bankers and the rich will take it in the seat of the pants, but we will see. And when we know, we will be sure to let you all know. So I like to thank everybody so much for joining us today. It has been a pleasure to be able to share these thoughts and ideas with y'all. And without our audience, we would just be a few people shouting into the void of the internet. So we greatly appreciate you all joining us. And as we say at Crowdsourced Politics, keep your head up through the political storm.